So now I'm going to show you a different way to access different elements in an array. So we looked at one way, which was to change the indexing in the third part of the for loop statement. So we're going to access elements based on a value of I rather than the changing index. And we're going to compare and contrast these two ideas. So the idea of accessing elements based on a test of I and based on changing the index. So it'll become a little more clear when you watch the video. So for the most part, we've been accessing pretty much every element of the array. Even in the last video where we had the if statement that only actually did something if the bank transaction, that particular transaction was less than 0, we still accessed every single element. Now there are a few ways that we can skip elements over, and we saw one of them a couple of videos ago when we talked about different indexing. So for example, if we have our for loop that's like this, so let's just set it up. I guess we should put this inside of a function. Let's put it here. So yeah, we have our for loop, and then we have, for example, in I equals 0, and then we go I less than, let's say, 5, and then I equals I plus 1. One of the ways we change the indexing is we modified this part of it. So maybe I equals I plus 2 would skip elements, so it would only access every other element in the array, or I equals I plus 3, for example, to access only every third element. But what else we can do is we can actually access elements based on the value of I. So to show you what I mean, I want to first create an array. So let's just create an integer array, and this one I'm just going to call int array. Okay, and I'm just going to initialize this to have some random values. So it's going to be a mix of odd numbers and even numbers, and there's not very many even numbers in here. And there we go. So it's just a bunch of integers right now. Some of them are even and some of them are odd. Now, if we wanted to access only the odd numbers in this array, what we could do is something like this. So we want to go less than int array dot length. So what we could do is we could go through each element and say we're going for each element and then int array, or I guess we should test this. So if the int array of index I is mod 2, it is 0, then we can do something then, for example, maybe print it out or store it in a variable. So this is testing each specific element, the value of each element, and saying if the element mod 2 is 0, then we'll do something. Now if you haven't seen this before, this is the modulo operator. So this is basically the same as saying a remainder. So this can be read if the element divided by 2 has a remainder of 0, so basically the element is even, then we'll do something. And actually this is a very useful operator to know, this modulo one, because if this is a way we test for evenness, because if this mod 2 is 1, then we know it's odd, whereas if the variable of the integer mod 2 is 0, we know it's even. So that's how you distinguish between even and odd. So just a fun side note. So this is basing the test on the actual value. However, if we want to access maybe only odd indexes, again we could do this, I equals I plus 2, or we could just say, we could test I itself. So if I mod 2 equals 0, then we'll do something, otherwise we won't. So maybe if I mod 2 is 0, then we'll store our variables in, we'll have some kind of addition. So we could have an integer that is total value, and we'll set it to 0 for now. Then we could have total value, And what do we have here? We have forgot the equals. Could have total value equals total value plus the int array of I. Okay, so what this is doing is it's going to go through the indexes, so this is still accessing every single element of the array. This is where it's a little different from just doing this, because if we change the index within the brackets in the for loop, this is actually completely ignoring every other element in the array. It doesn't even look at it, doesn't touch it, it doesn't do anything with it. Whereas if we have it indexing by 1, it's still accessing every element in the array, but it's only doing something if we're on an I that is even. So if I equals 0, it will do this. If I equals 1, which will be the next iteration, it won't do anything. If I equals 2, that's going to be the iteration afterwards, then we'll have something happen, etc. So just another way to index. So I'll have total value, let's have label text equal total value. And I guess we should change this to string. Okay, so now this is only going to add the odd numbers. So I'll show you that the results of this and doing this are exactly the same. So let's go ahead and run this. So we're going to run with the iPhone, I guess iPhone 5 this time. And just wait for it to build. Get rid of that. And it's going to take a little while to load up, clearly. So again, adding only every other element. Okay, so we get 23. Alright, so remember that number, 23. Okay, and then we're going to modify this a bit. So I'm just going to comment this out, and I'm going to comment this out. So now all this array is doing, or rather all this for loop is doing, is, I'm going to change that to 2, is it's pretty much doing exactly the same thing as before, except this time it's only accessing every other element. So rather than accessing every element and only doing something on every other iteration, we're going to only access every other element. So we had it equaling 23 before. Let's see if we get the same value now. And it's just running, being a little slow, but that's okay. And what are we going to get? It's going to be 23. So this is basically doing exactly the same thing. It's just two ways to accomplish the same task. And that's the beauty about computer science, is there are so many different ways to accomplish the same task. Some of them are more efficient than others, some of them are perhaps better used in certain situations, but this is just another way to consider indexing, is by testing I itself rather than the value at the index of I. In this part of the tutorial, I showed you a different way to access different elements in an array. So before we had only accessed different elements, or rather changed the indexing up by changing that index factor at the third part of the for loop statement. So this time we accessed elements based on a test run by I. So again, rather than changing that indexing factor, we actually, within the for loop, tested I to see if I itself was divisible by 2. So basically, if it was odd, then we didn't do anything. If it was even, then we added all the numbers together. So by now you should be able to demonstrate these two ways of accessing different indexes in an array. Again, two ways to accomplish the same task, and both have their merit in different situations.